Hello friends, and welcome to the channel, where we delve into the mind of a villain. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at the mind of Edwin Epps, the terror of a slave owner from the biopic film 12 Years a Slave. We'll be exploring his mindset, his motivations, and how they cause some of the most despicable behaviors seen on screen. But bear in mind, we'll be keeping to only the events of the film, as his actual list of heinous acts is too long to be covered. And when hearing about them, they are so horrific that they may appear unbelievable to some. With that out of the way, let's begin. The film delves into the journey of Solomon Northup, a free man who was unjustly sold into slavery for 12 years after getting tricked and kidnapped. In the course of the film, he is eventually sold to Edwin Epps, a cotton plantation owner. Even before meeting him, Epps has a reputation that precedes him, as William Ford warns Solomon that he is a hard man who prides himself for his ability to break the spirit of his slaves. Epps is a downright cruel man, a harsh taskmaster who expects unreasonable standards from his slaves and mercilessly punishes them when they failed to meet it. The film wastes no time in showing his rationale. We learn this in his debut scene in the movie. In addition to seeing his slaves as his property, which was a legal sentiment at the time, Epps believes that his inhumane treatment of his slaves is sanctioned and supported by Holy Scripture. He takes Bible passages out of context, citing the parable of the unprepared servant, and mistakenly applies them to his slaves. So whenever they fail to do his will, which is often unattainable, he believes that Scripture encourages him to have his slaves beaten with many stripes. Epps also mistreats his slaves as he doesn't recognize them as human. He mentions this to Bass later in the film, when he retorts that comparing a white man to a slave is like comparing a white man to a baboon. While his slaves are technically his property, Epps feels that this entitles him to treat them however he pleases and justifies his abuse of them to the point where he threatens to kill every last one of them out of rage. But even if he objectifies them, this is another flawed perception, as everyone in their right mind would wish to take care of what is theirs, as abusing their property is against their own self-interest. A loyal and faithful slave would most definitely be a more productive worker. Epps, on the other hand, is a sadist who enjoys inflicting pain and suffering on his slaves. He lays unreasonable standards on them, whipping them simply because they picked less cotton than the previous day, although their current day's labor is respectable. Their working conditions are horrid, left to toil under the scorching heat with little rest, wearing ill-fitted and tattered clothes, all while under the threat of facing the lash of his whip at the end of the day. Epps' discrimination is seen when he doesn't punish or even scold Armsby, simply because he is a white man, when his cotton yield is much lower than the rest of the slaves. He extends to his slaves none of the same care that he shows to the white people who serve as hired hands, something which Bass calls him out on. Despite his heinous acts, he is still deceptively self-righteous. After brutally whipping Patsy for no good reason, when Solomon warns him that one day he will have to answer for this sin, Epps replies, "There is no sin," as he is simply doing as he pleases with his property. He then follows up with one of his most grotesque lines, when he declares that he is of great pleasure after whipping Patsy. His self-righteousness is also seen when his plantation is plagued by cotton worms, and he becomes defensive, wondering what he's done to incur God's wrath. Immediately after, he concludes that it's the fault of his slaves, saying it's this godless lot, and proceeds to whip them to vent his resentment. Epps appears to have a seared conscience when it comes to abusing his slaves. One of the film's dialogues delves into this concept. Armsby, a hired hand on Shaw's plantation, makes an insightful comment. He mentions that his time as a former overseer was no easy chore on the spirit. In his own words, "No man of conscience can take the lash to another human day in and day out without shredding at his own self. Either he makes excuses or finds some way to trample on his guilty sensations." Epps must have crossed that point long ago, excusing his behavior with the previously mentioned scripture taken out of context. Perhaps this also might be why Epps is a man constantly given to alcohol. The strong drink serves as a coping mechanism for his guilt. But his frequent inebriated state clouds his already faulty judgment even further, much to the plight of his slaves. It is not known or revealed as to why Epps is the way he is emotionally. We know how he justifies his behavior, but we do not know the source of his anger. As Shaw's wife comments, anger is his constant condition. For someone from the plantation class who appears well-to-do, Epps appears to be a man who has it all. There is a saying that goes, "It is not the fault of the slaveholder that he is cruel, so much as it is the fault of the system under which he lives." That might be true to some limited extent. A look at modern psychology might give a bit of insight, specifically the Stanford experiment. The study exemplifies that when individuals are given absolute power over others, their cruel nature starts to rear its ugly head. Epps, being a slave owner, enjoys this same absolute power over his slaves, being free to treat them however he wishes. But this absolute power does not create the negative traits, it only surfaces them. Or in short, power only makes you more of what you already are. As we see with other slave owners, namely William Ford and Jonas Ray, they treat their slaves with dignity and respect, to the point that they willingly serve their masters faithfully. So we must conclude that Epps' mistreatment of his slaves has its origin in his own character, but it was enabled and made manifest by the legal slavery of his era. And on a side note, it must be said that every slave owner, regardless of how well they treated their slaves, is still inherently evil, albeit lesser than their abusive peers. As for Epps, despite his mistreatment and his low opinion of his slaves, he is ironically dependent on them, not only financially, but emotionally as well. Michael Fassbender, who plays the character, mentioned in an interview that Epps has this need to be around them all the time. Indeed, in the film, there is hardly a scene, if any, in which Epps appears without his slaves. His emotional dependence on his slaves is seen most by his relationship with Patsy, his most persecuted slave. Epps chooses to make Patsy the object of his lust instead of having relations with his wife, which by itself is torture for Patsy already. But it's made worse by Mistress Epps' jealousy and retaliation after Epps plainly tells her that he would rather do away with her than be rid of Patsy. Epps is overly possessive and jealous over Patsy and is constantly fearful that she would run off, or worse, be intimately involved with Shaw, another plantation owner. When she goes missing for a time, his reaction speaks volumes. He is completely devastated and hysterical, and starts threatening his other slaves out of desperation. Sadistic, self-righteous, and brutal, Edwin Epps was a cruel slave owner with little to no redeeming qualities. He was a self-righteous sadist who took pleasure in inflicting pain on others, one who took advantage of the prevailing law on slavery to express his inner monstrosity. Ironically, despite looking down on his slaves, he was dependent on them in more ways than one, and would be left destitute without them. So what do you think of Edwin Epps, folks? Let me know in the comments below, along with any other characters you'd like to see here.